of a drastic and dramatically underfunded public service. I want to turn our attention to the graph that's outlined in figure 1.2. In figure 1.2 on page 7 of the Auditor General's report, it suggests that the Canada Border Service Agency continued to rely heavily on external resources to develop ArriveCAN from April 2020 to March 2023. You could see there in many instances, we're seeing it at least in some cases, the doubling of the costs that would be associated with development of these kinds of apps internally to the government versus the cost that is present to the government when looking at external contracts. These external contracts balloon dramatically. Look at the Phoenix Pay system today, in the billions of dollars originally contracted out by the Conservatives, and we're still dealing with that terrible decision today. And so now we're seeing the Liberals continue in that tradition, continue to underfund our public service, and continue to see what is the worst case scenario for Canadians. I also want to look at a very important fact that I think now that the Public Health Agency of Canada is present here today that I'd like to point to. In the Auditor General's findings, it was found that there was actually an instance where the Public Health Agency and the Canadian Border Services actually undertook a process of jointly finding ways to develop this app. But what we found was in that process that they failed to actually come into an agreement of governance, an agreement of budget, an agreement of process, an agreement ultimately as to who was going to be overseeing and operating this project. To the president of the Public Health Agency of Canada, how could it have been for almost a year long that we've seen no formal agreement between Public Health Agency of Canada and the Canadian Border Services in regards to governance? Can you explain why?
We've already acknowledged that it would have been appropriate, and certainly in future we will be putting in place formal governance. What I can say is
no, it's certainly inappropriate, President. It's inappropriate that this took place. It's not appropriate. I would fail to use that word. I want to understand, why is it that the Public Health Agency undertook a process that didn't involve the appropriate level of good governance? It's established in the report that COVID-19 and the processes to which the Treasury Board undertook to waive or to make more expedient the outputs of the government at this time were not acceptable, is not an acceptable excuse to avoid good governance models. How is it, again, that the Public Health Agency, knowing that fact, that's a well-established principle of the Treasury Board, was able to come into an agreement with the Canadian Border Service Agency without a formal agreement on governance? Is this directly a failure?
There was close collaboration between the Public Health Agency and the Canadian Border Services Agency in the elaboration and development of ArriveCAN. However, there was no formal project governance put in place and no documentation of those decisions, which the Auditor General has pointed out. We acknowledge that, and we believe that that is a best practice that should be put in place in all future crises, and we have taken steps to ensure that in all future responses that this is part of our standard operating procedure and protocol.
Whose decision was it to not create a formal governance structure?
The intense nature of the collaboration and the development meant that these teams were meeting on a daily or even weekly basis. There was no deliberate decision not to put in place a governance structure.
But if you're meeting that often, Ms. Jeffrey, you must understand the frustration Canadians have and members of Parliament must have when present to a situation where you're meeting in a room every single week and you still fail to, one, address the issues of cost, two, the issues of governance, and three, finally, the ability to actually come into an agreement that actually sees some of these issues having fair oversight. To me, seems like a very, very tenuous connection between what you think is good governance and what is truly poor governance. This is a dramatic failure, Ms. Jeffrey, and one that has cost Canadians millions of dollars. We cannot simply say that there was good intention between the CBSA and the Public Health Agency of Canada. They met every week, but failed to address the questions of governance and failed to address the questions of cost. If that's what you're saying is true, then that has to be the case, or we're led to believe that this lack of governance went unquestioned, and the nature of these meetings were really not ones of governance. Which one is it?
I would say that the nature of the meetings at that time in March 2020 were focused on the significant time pressure to develop an app that would allow the border to permit the flow of critical people and goods. And so the operational outcomes were the overriding subject of conversation and the necessity of layering the public health measures. Unfortunately, as we've acknowledged, there was not formal governance throughout that time. And that lack of formal governance.
Did the minister know about that lack of formal governance?
I'm afraid that is the time, Mr. Desjardins. You will get another opportunity down the road.
Thank you, Chair.
Turning now to Mr. Brock, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for your attendance. I'd like to open with a comment. For the record, spending under Justin Trudeau's government on outside consultants and contracts has more than doubled, costing taxpayers $20 billion. And now we have a classic example of government waste and abusing the taxpayer. So I'm going to focus my questions to you, Ms. Jeffrey. You mentioned in the earlier rounds that ultimately you report to Minister Hajdu at the time during the implementation of the ArriveCan app. She was your direct minister. And you also reported to the PCO, the Privy Council Office. Is that correct?
Yes, the role of the President of the Public Health Agency of Canada.
Yeah. And directly reporting to the PCO is the clerk of the Privy Council is who you'd be reporting to. Correct?
For the purposes of the administration of the public service.
Right. But during the course of the ArriveCan implementation, you are reporting to the Privy Council office. And you are aware that the Privy Council office literally acts as a deputy minister for the Prime Minister. Is that correct?
The Public Health Agency functions as part of a health portfolio.
I'm not asking you about that, ma'am. I'm asking you about the structure of the Privy Council office. That's the question. And would you agree with me that that really acts as a deputy minister to the Prime Minister?
Yes, that's one of the functions.
Thank you. Now, I want to know, without getting into specifics, I want to know about all the contacts, whether they be telephone, whether they be email, whether they be in person, all the contacts that you had with both Minister Hajdu and the clerk of the Privy Council during the implementation of the ArriveCan app. So how frequently, let's start with the Minister Hajdu, how frequently were you consulting with her and informing her about the implementation of the app?
So I would just clarify that it would be the role of the President of the Public Health Agency, since I've been in the role for 1 year, so not me personally. However, there was structured COVID governance focused on the measures that were being taken at the border. So here I want to distinguish.
Again, I'm not talking, ma'am, the question is very specific. I'm not talking about content. I'm talking about frequency. So whether you were in the role as the president or the deputy minister at all relevant times or another colleague, how often were you consulting, telephone, email, meetings with Minister Hajdu during the implementation of the app, but specifically the 177 versions of the app is the question. Can you provide an answer to that, please?
As it regards to the response to the COVID pandemic, the President of the Public Health Agency would have been in very frequent contact. I can't give a specific number, but in terms of the overall health response, the orders in council that developed the measures at the border, there was established governance that has been publicly disclosed.
Now let's move on to the PCO. Same question, frequency. How often?
There were regular committees and governance structures that met about the COVID response.
Okay. And clearly you were not sharing with either Minister Hajdu or the clerk of the Privy Council all of the failings that the Auditor General has identified. Were you?
The responsibility to put in place the governing structure around the development of the app was.
Were you explaining to them about all the failings as identified by the Auditor General? Were you explaining to them that we have no contract, we have no budget? Were you giving some indication that this is really falling off the rails? Did you do that?
We were briefing, I'm sure at the time, on the operational requirement to stand up a digitized mechanism.
Did the
to
minister,
facilitate
did the
border
minister
travel.
or the Privy Council, the clerk of the Privy Council, ever ask you about costs? Yes or no?
I was not in the role at the time, so I can't speak to that specifically. But I can say that the development of the app and the time pressures and the operational requirements.
It sounds to me, ma'am.
That is the time, Mr. Brock.
Thank you.
I'm afraid. Ms. Khalid, a good day. You have the floor for 5 minutes,
you.
please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I think I've said this before with other witnesses during committees that we've been able to question. I am very, very disappointed with how this whole procurement process has happened, and with a disregard, in my opinion, for public dollars, for taxpayer dollars, in how we conducted ourselves. But I do want to get to the accountability piece of it, and I know that the Conservatives are doing their thing, but I do want to put the question to our PHAC officials. Did the Prime Minister sign off on these contracts?
These contracts were concluded at different levels in the public service.
Did the Prime Minister sign off on them?
No, the Prime Minister is not a signatory to these contracts.
Was a minister a signatory to these contracts?
No.
So this report by the Auditor General, which is a really good report, I think, in terms of a wake-up call to ensure that we are making sure that there's accountability for the dollars that we spend. What steps do you think need to be taken to ensure that transparency and that accountability occurs going forward?
So both the Auditor General and the Office of the Ombuds for Procurement have made a series of recommendations that are being fully implemented by the Public Health Agency. On our part, we have put in place specific governance and operating procedures around contracting in emergencies to ensure that the lessons of this are incorporated into all future responses. We have stood up a contract review committee that is assessing contracts to make sure we have consistency across our organization. We have put in place training and new governance for quality assurance of contracts and to ensure that documentation is on file. We will be implementing all of the recommendations made by both of those offices in short order.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And with respect to this organization, GC Strategies, in December of last year, our Public Accounts Committee had worked together to ensure that we are continuing to hold the government to account, especially with this issue, and to make sure that we are doing right by taxpayers' dollars. We had put together a motion in a very collaborative fashion to ensure that we move forward in a good way, and that we are doing the work with respect to that accountability as much as we can. It has come to light, there was an article in Le Journal de Montréal last week, which reported that the founders of GC Strategies received millions in contracts from the Harper government under the name Corridor Systems Consulting. Mr. Chair, given that information, and to continue to add to the context of the work that we have already done on this, I do have a motion that I am moving right now. Pursuant to the motion adopted on December 12th, 2023, in